to Hotel Bar Sessions, the podcast where three philosophers sit down at the end of a long conference day to chop it up at the hotel bar, which, as we all know, is where the real philosophy happens.
Welcome to another episode of Hotel Bar Sessions. I'm Rick Lee, and I am joined today by only one of my co-hosts, Lee Johnson. We have a special guest, and we'll find out more about that. And today we are talking about refusal. But as usual, we need some drinks, and I want to find out whether you all are ranting or raving. So Lee, let me start with you.
Well, I'm going to have an amaretto sour today, and I am raving about Steven Spielberg. Now, I know this is an unpopular rave among highbrow aesthetic folks. Most people think that Steven Spielberg is overly sentimental and popular in the wrong kind of way, but I can't quit him. He gets me in the feels every time. I have just recently rewatched the 1977 film Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and that is such a brilliant film. And I really think it's a film that could be remade today, maybe with artificial intelligence instead of aliens. You know, it's got all of the what's really going on out there, conspiracy theory stuff, and it's just a great film. So thanks, Steven Spielberg. You hit me in the feels again. So I'm really happy to announce our guest today, Devonya Havis. Devonya is an associate professor in the Department of Comparative Literature and the Global Gender and Sexuality Studies Department at the University of Buffalo. Her research and teaching areas cover critical philosophy of race, contemporary continental philosophy, predictive technologies, and critical disability studies. Also, she describes herself as a Southerner with Northern tendencies, but we'll shake that hornet's nest later. Havis's groundbreaking work, Creating a Black Vernacular Philosophy, published by Rowman and Littlefield in 2022, explored how everyday Black vernacular practices invoked to negotiate survival and joy can be understood as philosophy in its own right, focusing on creative formations that take place within Black American diasporic cultures via narratives, the blues, jazz, work songs, and other expressive productions. Havis's book articulates a form of Black vernacular philosophy that is both centered within and emerges from meaning structures cultivated by Black communities. Her pedagogy actively promotes social justice, perhaps most strikingly evident in the Immersion East Side program that she co-designed and has directed for over a decade, which engages students in the unique rites, rituals, cultural practices, and refusals of Buffalo's largely Black East Side residents, who operate in a context of numerous structural, social, and political impediments. The Immersion Eastside program not only confronts and critically examines these realities, but also celebrates the historical capacity of Buffalo's Black community to create possibility from impossibility. Now, the last time I talked to Devonya was at an actual hotel bar only about a month ago. So, Devonya, welcome to our familiar haunt. And what are you drinking and ranting or raving about this week?
Well, thank you for the invite. It is great to hang out with you in this hotel bar, as it was a month ago, and that other hotel bar, which will go unnamed. I am having a non-alcoholic drink, which is my usual, and this was the joke in grad school that I was the cheap date because I didn't consume alcohol. And I would always have a seltzer with a healthy dose of Rosie's lime juice. So that is my drink. And I could not determine if I had a rant or a rave. This morning I woke up and I started listening to Miles Davis's Sketches of Spain. And I just love the way that Davis blends these classical Spanish sounds with this jazz vibe. So I will rave about that and rant about being on social media this morning and reading the comments. I don't know why I doom scroll in those ways. So doom scrolling is my rant. Miles Davis is my rave.
That's a good one. Both of those are good ones. Rick, what about you?
I'm going to have a bee's knees. And today I am raving about former guest of the podcast and my nephew, Blake Zolfo. Early in October, Blake ran for the second time the Chicago Marathon. He set a goal for himself to finish in 4.5 hours, and he finished in 4 hours, 15 minutes. And for a non-regular marathon runner, that's a pretty damn good time. So I'm so proud of him, and he raised tons of money for the charity. So I'm raving about Blake.
Way to go, Blake.
Yes.
So Lee, I know we're talking about refusal, but what exactly does that mean?
Well, refusing can be a powerful act, whether it's standing up to authority, rejecting harmful norms, or pushing back against injustice. But when is saying no the right thing to do? And what are the stakes when we decide to refuse? Often, our refusals are quotidian and inconsequential, but sometimes, and sometimes even without our knowledge, they're huge. I think we underestimate how often we issue refusals, both large and small, and we don't consider carefully enough the moral and political dimensions of those acts. It's not always easy to decide when it is appropriate to refuse. Even when we know it's necessary, it's not always easy to do. So our guest today, Devonya Havis, has been thinking about the ethics and politics of refusal for some time, and we're very glad to have her with us today to chat about how refusing can be an act of courage, rebellion, or sometimes survival. We're going to ask what happens when, and I never thought I'd appeal to this person on this podcast, but in the immortal words of Nancy Reagan, you just say no.
I refuse.
As Rick and listeners of this podcast know, I often start with the exact same question, which is the what is it question, the definitional question. And so before we jump into some of the more stickier points, I wanted to ask you, Devonya, what is refusal?
Well, I've been thinking a lot about this because when I started this work, I was gung-ho about the idea of resistance. I had some suspicions about our ability to absolutely overthrow, I'll call it, the man, and exactly what it would mean if we overthrew the man. Like, how could we prevent yet another man from taking power? And even worse, what if we ourselves are actually the man? And so the question of revolution was a little bit more difficult. So I thought maybe resistance. And then I kept encountering ways that resistance demanded a kind of complicity with structures that I thought were deeply problematic, or were having to navigate structures in ways that cost a price that is hard to pay. Mm-hmm. I was directed toward indigenous scholars who have been working specifically with terms of refusal as a way to approach things, but also beginning to explore places where in literature, in music, people are actually refusing structures as they are given or as they are assumed to be. So in terms of refusal, one, it's not a call for reform. It can be a refusal of the governing terms or conditions or frameworks that were given. It can be a method, an ethical practice, a refusal of recognition. And I like to lean into that refusal is generative. It often happens, as Simpson notes, when discourse breaks down, where you really don't have any other place to go. That makes it potentially generative. So I want to think of refusal as generative and an ethical call. And when we encounter it in these everyday ways, how do we invoke refusal as a particular kind of practice?
I want to pull on one of the things you said because it's something I've been thinking a lot about, and that was your suspicion about resistance. Resistance always has to play the game of that which it's resisting.
Yes.
There's a strange kind of affirmation in resistance. And so I'm wondering, could you say a little bit about how refusal either stops the game or doesn't play the game, or how it gets out of this logic of force and counterforce on the same terrain?
That's a great question. And I was thinking about Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. There's a point where the protagonist who is Black, who never actually gets a name, which I find is a really interesting aspect of the novel. But he's saying, I'm invisible because people refuse to see me. And throughout the novel, he's trying to generate ways of being seen. But by the end of the novel, he's like, I no longer want recognition because recognition is an assent. It's a way of assenting to a structure that has framed me outside of it. Or that has framed me in a way that I am always problematic within it. And he says, so I'm going to refuse recognition because that means I've got to assent.
Right.
Also, I think to your point, if we are in an oppositional position, we're always already bound up with the thing that we're in competition with.
Yeah.
For me, refusal leans into the ways that perhaps we need to pivot to something else. And they're often oblique pivots. I think the idea of directly and bald-facedly refusing is often challenging. And sometimes the refusals are in not being complicit, in those little acts that we invoke in the everyday.
I like that example from Invisible Man because on the one hand, we could easily see the refusal of recognition of the protagonist of Invisible Man as morally culpable and his refusal of that refusal as morally laudable. One of the things that I want to try to get to is whether or not there's a form or a structure to when a refusal is morally appropriate and when it's not. So I think often we think about very famous historical refusals like Socrates in The Apology or Martin Luther King Jr. in Letter to the Birmingham Jail or...
Letter from a Birmingham jail.
Oh, yeah, right. He's writing to the jail. Dear jail.
Hello, jail.
Oof. Anyway, we often think of very famous refusals like Socrates, like Martin Luther King Jr., even the very, very few people in the Milgram experiment who refused to turn the dial. And we think, here is where refusal really stands as a kind of moral exemplar.
And it's heroic, right?
Yeah, and it's heroic, yeah. And I'm wondering if placed in different contexts, all of those same refusals could have the exact opposite moral valence. So does the moral valence of refusal come down to the particular contextual circumstances, or is there a kind of model of refusal that is morally exemplary?
Can I give the classic philosopher both and? Yes and no.
Well, I mean, I'm a Duridian, so I've just assumed that that's the case.
Oh, good. I'm in good company then. But I would like to talk about the idea of context. For me, the idea of indexing rather than setting a normative standard for what is heroic and what is morally praiseworthy becomes useful, because what is complicity in one setting might be radical in another setting, and we get there through a kind of relationality. Often, as philosophers, we're going to the abstract to talk about things in general, but we live in a world where we're embodied in relationship, and we're in relationship not only to other people, but also institutions.
I do want to push on this just a little bit, though, because one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. Right?
Yes.
Like that's, of course, the case. But I still want to believe that there might be some models of refusal that are not so easily reversible in that same way.
I agree. And I like to think about refusals, I'll lean into Foucault on this, that emerge from a critical attitude.
Right, yeah.
That emerge from a desire to make the world a livable place for a broad array of people, not just your own in-group, right? That, to me, seems to track with the historic refusals that we see with King, who is aligned with the 1960s Black freedom movement. It would also align with other movements of that sort. So I want to say just saying no is not the same as refusing. And I think there's got to be a critical aspect that is at work when we're thinking about what it means to move beyond resistance to refusal.
Just for Dave, Michel Foucault is a 20th century French philosopher, and that's who Devonya was referring to there. You pointed out refusals that are complicit and refusals that are not complicit. I'm wondering if that doesn't help us a little bit to figure out, okay, it's not a universal norm, but there are refusals that open possibilities and there are refusals that foreclose possibilities. And the refusals that foreclose possibilities are not morally exemplary and they're also not heroic.
So we can think about this idea of refusals that limit the possibility for others to exercise certain kinds of freedoms. In real
exactly.
ways. Like the freedom to survive or the freedom to live a meaningful life or to cultivate oneself.
Right.
I want to go back to something you said a minute ago. You said to just say no is not to refuse. And I'm trying to wrap my head around that because, even in, again, everyday quotidian saying no's in my life, if I don't let someone merge into traffic, if I say, no, you can't cut in here, right? Or if the waiter asks me if I want a refill on my Diet Coke and I say no, those are refusals, are they not? I suppose I wonder if you could draw out the difference between just saying no and a refusal.
Well, is saying no a refusal or is it a response? And maybe I'm going to be not as quick on my feet in trying to draw out this distinction, but I also want to put it into context with respect to power dynamics, right?
Right.
So I am in a particular relationship with a server who invites me to consent or to refuse. If refusal is not a possibility, then consent is not either. And so I want to think about the power dynamics at work when we're beginning to talk about these heroic or ethically meaningful forms of refusal, and in that way distinguish them from just saying no or just taking a conservative position towards something. And I don't mean conservative in the left or right sense, but am I trying to conserve the status quo? Am I trying to unsettle the established order in some way, not by designating an answer, but by raising critical questions about whether or not it is operating in ways that are just? And for me, that's at the heart of the question. Am I engaged in a set of power relations that are inhibiting my ability to pursue, we'll call it abstract forms of justice and freedom, but I also think about them personally. Can I move through the world in ways where I don't feel myself always at risk?
Right.
That's really helpful. It's almost as if there's a little r refusal and a big capital R refusal.
Right. Which is why I'm always like, if you're living in a community that has no opportunities for economic growth and you say to that person, just say no to drugs, they don't have the possibility to refuse or to consent. The material conditions are such that what you're defining as heroic in the just say no is already a structural impossibility. And so I want to say something important about the difficulty of people moving through those kinds of relationships, that some people move through the world with greater ease because structures support their easeful movement through the world. Some people move through the world with a lot of friction and still have to find ways to act that I want to mark as also heroic.
I wonder if one of the complexities involved in giving a set of norms about refusal doesn't point to a deeper complexity. And the way I'm thinking about it is that we might distinguish between what we would call on the one hand strategy and on the other hand theory. Mm-hmm. And so, for example, I could be a fantastic Marxist theorist of the revolution, but where I should bring, this armed band of people to fight and in what context and so on is not coextensive with my theoretical abilities there. And I wonder if part of the issue of refusal isn't saying that strategy needs to inform theory a whole lot more than it does, that we need to depurify theory in a certain way. And yes, that makes theory messy, but it's a necessary mess, that it's an unavoidable mess that we in philosophy have been avoiding for too long.
Yeah, this is what Charles Mills would call the problem of ideal theory as ideology.
Right, exactly.
And I think in certain ways we can, as philosophers, limit ourselves by trying to come up with these nice, pristine theories without acknowledging how messy they are in the world of practice. And that's a bit of why I lean into Foucault. It's also why I lean into social movements and what people engaged in those social movements are saying about the messiness of trying to be in coalition and trying to build things and organize. And I do this from the standpoint of being someone who theorizes for my day job, but also as someone who wants to take seriously what folks are doing in the world where they're trying to make sense of things. And it's super important to have some theorizations that guide our strategy. The idea of tactics is also part of strategy, right? Refusal can be a tactic, but sometimes, as my dad would say, I have to render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, right? I can't always refuse, even if in some moments my ethical imperatives encourage me to refuse. Sometimes I might have to retreat as a kind of refusal. And here I'm thinking of the I Ching, the Book of Changes, and it's got this hexagram called retreat. I was reading it, kind of working out some things, and I'm like, what do you mean retreat? This is a battle. This is about social justice. How can you retreat? The oracle is like, retreat is not just running away and abandoning it. It is understanding that sometimes if things are stacked against you, simply facing it head on is going to exhaust your energy.
Yeah.
Instead, you retreat. And what I really liked about the way it talked about this is retreat is not abandoning the field to your opponent. It is a strategic withdrawal where you engage in acts of resistance to prepare the field for your eventual return.
Yeah, it's retreat as repositioning.
Yes, yes.
Hey, listeners, have you ever thought to yourself, I'd really love to join them after this episode for a drink? Well, you could do that if you wanted to fly Rick and David from Chicago or me from Memphis to wherever you are, and we're not taking that option off the table. But in the meantime, we'd love to hear back from all of you via social media. You can reach us on Twitter at Hotel Bar Podcast, on Facebook, and on YouTube. You can always email us at hotelbarpodcast@gmail.com, and we will respond. Look, we know you're out there. We've got the data, and we want to hear from you. Books or articles we should read, interview guests we should have, topics we should cover. We're listening. Sometimes podcasting feels like shouting into a void, and so we always appreciate hearing back from our listeners. In the meantime, back to the episode.
Devonya, we mentioned earlier in the conversation two what I think are sort of critical examples, but we didn't tease them out very much. One was Socrates, and I could point to two refusals that Socrates engages in, one in the Apology and the other in the Crito. And then the other one that came up was Martin Luther King Jr. in his situation in a Birmingham jail. And so I'm wondering if first you could talk about the ways in which these are examples of what interests you about refusal and what is exemplary about these examples.
Oh, thank you for that. Since being a professor is my day job that involves teaching, I often wonder how might one go about training someone to attune themselves to those points where we want to encourage refusal, and how do you practice the habit of being able to refuse. And for me, Socrates in the Apology and the Crito offers a way to think about how we might index productive forms of refusal. The idea that one is not simply providing answers, but one is engaged in a communal process of interrogating the way one lives or interrogating the values that society has laid out for you seem to me a good guideline.
Right.
So that one can begin to think in critical ways about where might those opportunities to refuse be. And Socrates says, look, I have been attached to Athens much like a gadfly to a sluggish horse. I'm here to sting you out of your slumber. As I say to my students, well, what is the slumber? The slumber is that we're all hustling, trying to make sure we get paid, trying to make sure we can buy grits and groceries, trying to be popular, trying to live a life that we believe is going to make us happy. And maybe we're making compromises in pursuing those things that have become a slippery slope. And for me, that is the role of being stung out of your slumber. You're being asked those critical questions. And I like to lean into the way that Socrates says, look, this is going to cost me my life. There is some sacrifice in this. But the greater good here is that I am getting society to begin to ask questions about what it values. I'm not telling them what it should value. I'm merely saying we need to do some contemplation and establish some commitments around what we're going to value. And I think King, especially in A Letter from Birmingham Jail, aligns himself with that way of thinking. I also want to throw in, as a tennis fan, Naomi Osaka's refusal to continue to play. I think we can think of that also as a courageous refusal where she's raising questions about continuing to be competitive under certain conditions and is saying these are dismembering conditions.
So do you think that there are any refusals that don't have punitive consequences? Or would you say that if a refusal doesn't have any punitive consequences, then it's a little r refusal and not a capital R refusal?
I think I'm more interested in effects. So I think we can have little r refusals that don't have punitive consequences, that are refusals, or maybe they're refusals, as Saidiya Hartman would say, under cover of complicity. So I don't want to discount those because people don't suffer consequences for them. I want to say that they are also primers for how we might engage in larger refusals that ultimately may have and often do have consequences. Maybe if we're thinking consequences, we can do little c consequences, which are the sheer discomfort of galvanizing oneself to refuse, even in the small ways. One must marshal oneself to engage in the kind of conflict that ensues.
What I find interesting about the apology example is that when I teach it, I often talk about the two parts as the trial phase and the penalty phase. And what is, I think, most often striking to readers and certainly to students is that in the penalty phase, Socrates says, you've convicted me. The only possible punishment you could give is you need to kill me.
Right.
That is a moment of incredible refusal.
Yes.
He refuses to be complicit to an ethical and political structure that he spent the whole first part of the dialogue and his life in general trying to show he's committed to. I mean, I'm not saying that every refusal has to lead to death, but there is a refusal to play the game that could have gotten him out of this.
Right.
I mean, I should say his first offer is they need to support him for the rest of his life and keep him fed and housed and so on.
As I tell my students, free lunch at City Hall is the appropriate penalty for this activity he's engaged in.
He's such an asshole.
And I love to say, so why do you think more people sentence him to death than convict him, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a really notable moment.
Right.
Whatever he's stirring up becomes even more potent when he refuses to back down, when he refuses to beg for his life.
Right.
And still he goes home and pays all his debts first.
Yeah.
What's up with this guy?
It's true.
He refuses to not be an asshole.
Yes, right.
Maybe we can think of this irony of what he's up to.
Yeah. So take this job and shove it kind of thing.
And yet he does the job that gets him no pay and causes his death. Like, he's doubling down on that job.
Yeah.
And to your point, in What is Critique, Foucault talks about how thinking critically about the values of one's governing modes and structures is also about critique. And he has these lines that I love. It's also about not wanting to be governed like that, or by those means, or according to those principles. It's also maybe about not accepting as true, and these are slightly modified quotes from Foucault. He's also saying, maybe I'm not accepting as true what an authority tells me is true, but wondering about the reasons why an authority is acting the way it is. And maybe I'm saying, I don't want to accept these laws because maybe they're unjust. And for me, that is what really begins to distinguish a Socrates from a king, because Socrates presumes that the laws of the nation state are just in ways that king cannot accept those laws as just. So for Socrates to accept death as the progression of a system of laws that he believes to be at core just, but inappropriately applied, is very different than a king who accepts imprisonment as a reasonable cost for engaging in civil disobedience.
Do you think that King's refusal there recognizes that if he would behave in a way such as to get out of the jail term and act otherwise would be a way of leaving in place the very thing he's trying to tear down? And so only by, in a sense, obeying the law does he bring to the fore the full measure of its oppressive power.
Yeah, and I think that is a tactic.
Yeah.
And I really think what we now call the civil rights movement, which at the time was often called the Black Freedom Movement, and I have a few things to say about that, but I'll hold that. Much of the tactic there was to demonstrate the slippage between these ideals of systems and structures and laws as objective and universal versus the practical experience of those laws as anything but universal and equally applied.
Right.
And it strikes me that those are some of the challenges in different clothing that we are confronting in the present. They've got different costumes on, but they're very similar kinds of challenges.
Sure.
You know, it's occurring to me now that the sense of refusal that you're drawing out here is very closely aligned with the notion of disobedience in the way that we use it in terms of civil disobedience. One of the things that is very powerful about civil disobedience, or even just the concept of disobedience, is that it posits implicitly obedience as something not virtuous.
Right.
That if you're just obeying, I mean, I'm going to let my inner Kantian out here, then you're not acting autonomously, right? You should be giving the law to yourself. If you're just obeying, then that's not morally or politically valuable in any way. And so drawing together what you've been saying about refusal, it seems to me that at the heart of it has to include some kind of disobedience, in as much as it's always situated within a power dynamic, that it has to be, in part, a refusal to obey.
Yes, as a unsettling of these conditions of normalized and normative behavior. These conditions in and of themselves have become problematic.
Right. And then because it is often, if not always, the case that in any power dynamic, the one who's being told to obey is always the one in the less powerful, more precarious position, then I wonder if you'd be willing to take the next step to say that it's always going to be the case that the refusals of those who are in the disadvantaged or precarious or oppressed position, those are going to be the ones that have the most effect, those refusals.
Yeah, I often think those are the refusals that draw attention to the power dynamics. Because if one accepts them as given or as natural, then those conditions of oppression or disadvantage are going to continue. So if I have any bias, I would say I'm much more interested in those points of refusal than other kinds of refusal. Because I'm really curious how we register the ways that people that we describe as politically powerless, as oppressed, as without authority or with impinged agency actually exercise forms of agency. I'm looking at people that one wants to manage. One wants to go, these are unruly populations. We need to manage them in ways that make them obedient, that make them productive for society according to our definitions of productivity. And this idea of unruliness that Falcone-Sheth leans into, this idea of a kind of dissidence or insurrection in terms of nonconformity, are the places that interest me most when we're thinking about refusal, because the invitation often from authority is an invitation to get the rewards that one acquires by being obedient. It also means that we have to think about the ways that power normalizes us to accept these things and to want us to be civil even when we're being disobedient. And sometimes incivility may be warranted. And I think that's something we see more in the contemporary moment as contrasted with someone like Martin Luther King. There's very much a presentation and visage of respectability that I think begins to fall out, definitely in more contemporary movements. And I think there's certain questions about leaning into that respectability that are reasonable to ask.
It strikes me that one of the reasons to look at this from the point of view of those in a position of being dominated or oppressed is that the structures of power, as you put it, and I accept wholeheartedly, the man, often operates or maybe operates best invisibly, as if it's not an exercise of power, as if it's not an exercise of authority. And there's a way in which a refusal from another perspective, besides the communities who are under the boot of that oppression, doesn't bring to visibility as much the operations of power that are causing these various kinds of dominance and oppression.
Right. And it also doesn't indicate that people, despite these conditions, manage to live lives of meaning. And those lives of meaning cannot come into existence by strict adherence to those structures that have created greater vulnerability and precarity for those folks. And for me, that's important. How do we think about something like the blues, not as about being sad, but about reconfiguring a way of being and sets of knowledges that embrace the wonder and the beauty of people living lives that are often quite difficult, not because of choices they've made, but because the conditions under which they live.
Hey, Hotel Bar Session listeners, this is Rick Lee. Do you know what kind of pillow I use or mattress I sleep on? No, of course you don't. And that's because we don't have any of those stupid ads for pillows or mattresses or any other crap that you don't even want. We are supported by you, our listeners. And if you want to keep our late night conversations flowing, why not do the equivalent of buying us a drink or giving us a high five? You could subscribe to our podcast at Patreon. That's patreon.com/hotelbarsessions. And you could subscribe at many levels. And hey, there's perks at those levels. You could get a coffee mug, or I might even call you out on an episode, or you could get early access to some of our episodes. There are lots of perks there, and we could really use your help. So go to patreon.com/hotelbarsessions and subscribe at any level you feel comfortable with. In the meantime, we'll see you back at the bar.
So I'd like to bring this down to a more micro level right now and talk a little bit about our very personal refusals that we make. You know, there was this article in The Atlantic recently noting what seems to be an epidemic of people instituting basically no contact rules with their immediate families. And that is also a kind of refusal. I mean, I think it might be a little bit of a stretch to say that's a refusal aimed at correcting injustice. But it certainly is a refusal that many people find necessary because of a different sort of precarity that they find themselves in their personal lives and emotional relationships. And then there are all kinds of just everyday workplace refusals that we do. No, I'm not going to be on another committee. No, I'm not going to put this stupid clause in my syllabus, right?
Yes.
Which, by the way, can I just say as an aside, that if something has to go on every syllabus, then why does it have to go on any syllabus?
Right.
Okay, that's off the soapbox. But at any rate, you see what I'm saying, right?
Yes.
That there are these personal refusals that, again, don't have world historical importance, may not even have robust ethical or political importance, but are hugely important to us as
Absolutely.
people who operate in a world with other people.
I'm wondering if there aren't some of these, what you're calling personal refusals, Lee. I mean, maybe they don't bring down the injustice, but aren't speaking, in fact, to a larger injustice. Because when you were talking about workplace refusals, I was thinking about, no, I'm not going to sit quietly here and be the woman you think I should be. I'm not going to pretend as if this curricular change isn't going to destroy the very nature of our enterprise. All of those kinds of things actually do open on to, I think, a larger issue. The family one is maybe slightly different, but I think some of the examples you used, I would say, are working toward exposing and fighting a kind of larger injustice.
I would agree. I began to think a lot about this. I was teaching in a philosophy department at a Jesuit school that had a justice requirement, and I intentionally did not put theories of justice on my syllabus, and I said, I'm going to teach theories about injustice, because how do we get to justice if we don't understand the nature of injustice?
Right.
And so I got basically a memo from the dean who's like, this is required to be on your syllabus. And I'm like, how well is it serving people to give us the ideal when discerning and better understanding what rigidifies injustice strikes me as a very important skill for young people in the world? Because how are you going to mitigate conditions of injustice if you don't understand them, you don't understand how they come into existence or how they're perpetuated? For me, I think it is often these moments in our everyday experience where we're encountering something we've got to negotiate that it really resonates. Can I refuse? What is the cost?
I completely agree with you, Devonya. And it occurs to me that our refusal muscle is something that has to be exercised, right? And these little refusals are like reps that we're doing every day so that we can make the bigger refusals. And, I'm now wondering whether or not it's the case. I'm a little bit worried that this is going to sound libertarian. So just try to bracket that part of it. But I'm now wondering if it's the case that even, for example, at our most intimate familial level or friend level, when we refuse, what we're trying to do is maintain myself as a person who is capable of refusing. The larger significance of the refusal may not be there, but it's important to me to still be the kind of agent or subject that can say no. And so as we kind of amp up the significance of my saying no's, my refusals, ultimately what I'm trying to be able to do is to refuse only those sorts of things that don't make for a world where others can't refuse. And that's where I think it sounds a little libertarian. Like my freedom stops where yours begins or something like that. But I don't think that that's a terrible ideal. Not the libertarian ideal. That's a terrible ideal. But I should refuse only in a way that allows for other people's refusals to still exist.
Oh, see, the Kant and the Sartre are seeping in.
I don't even try to hide them anymore,
But I also think it speaks to the idea that we are not fully autonomous beings, that our existence is in relationship and interdependent.
Yeah.
If you're in interdependent conditions, the capacity of people around you to be able to say no or to be able to consent also shapes the overall conditions that one is living in as part of a collective. I guess I would lean into the less libertarian side and say we are both individual and in collectives, and that often our collectivity also determines the possibilities for our individuality. And to operate in that dynamic brings to the fore the need for this habit. And it's also why I think about the Milgram experiments as instructive.
But wouldn't you grant that there are some intimate interpersonal conditions that are so toxic that they, in fact, make it impossible for me to refuse? I mean, you could think of an abusive relationship. You know what I'm saying? Like, so for the record, listeners, I want to also lean against the libertarian position. I'm just saying that the formulation that I'm trying to put forward here, that I ought to refuse in a way that doesn't impede other people's capacity to refuse. That seems to me something that is maybe what I was looking for right at the top of this episode, like a form of refusal that is ethically acceptable or laudable.
And I think Rick was gesturing toward that when he was saying, if we think about refusals that limit, that are not generative, those are probably not heroic kinds of refusals. So I think all that tracks.
But notice, Lee, you just gave the categorical imperative of refusal.
Yes.
Right? Always refuse in such a way that your refusal could make possible the refusal of all.
I mean, I think we've just all accepted now that my inner Kantian is an outer Kantian. Can we just move on? Hi, my name is Lee. I'm a Kantian.
Hi, Lee.
See, these are the parts for me of Kant that I'm just like, but wait a minute. What if my mere existence is cast as a refusal itself? Like the fact that I am in the room. And as Sarah Ahmed says, sometimes the mere presence of a brown body in the room is also shifting things, even if nothing is said.
But on the formulation I just gave, wouldn't that just simply mean that the refusal to recognize the brown body in the room is immoral? It's not the same as the brown body in the room's refusal of the brown body in the room.
I agree. I guess it's the infectedness by Foucault that I get when I'm like, are you trying to normalize me? And can we have these normative standards that are not also simultaneously normalizing, that are not simultaneously encouraging us to a kind of felt as natural complicity that we then begin to perpetuate. And I think I'm always concerned that we settle into points where we no longer have the capacity to see what is immoral, because we've been habituated or desensitized to it.
Fair.
Yeah, and what you're referring to as normalization could also be seen as a kind of naturalization, right? So that it's not just that this is the norm, but it now appears as if, well, this is just the way things are. Like, what are you talking about? And that's, I think, one of the dangers. And this goes back to my point about the invisibility of the modes of operation. I remember once having an argument with one of my former colleagues. He was of the opinion that the capitalist leaders of the United States and maybe worldwide actually get together in meetings and make decisions about various things. And I said to him, that's really inefficient, and capitalism operates in their interest already. There's no need to have these kinds of meetings. And that's the way this normalization works. And that's the way this naturalization works, is that no one has to talk about whiteness, right? Because it's just the way it is.
I think one of the things that I really like about the concept of queer, not just as an identity, but also as a verb, is that it enacts this refusal that can't be recognized by the system that is refusing it. It's easy to say, we're not going to recognize the queer person in the room. But it's not easy to say that, because you can't say, I'm not going to recognize that woman or that man or that straight person or that gay person, right? I mean, one of the things that queering does is it says, I'm going to take away the categories that you have for denying my capacity to refuse.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I've been on a tirade against recognition. I'm not saying don't recognize people, but I think seeking recognition ultimately reiterates certain kinds of misrecognition. And that if we believe that we can use moral suasion to turn people's bad behavior around, often we're just going to get our caricature of what they think someone wants, or domesticated version of something that is not legible to them. And I like the idea that there are just some things that are not legible. There's some things that are just queer and they don't fit. I do think that's an important part of power dynamics. And I'm also thinking about what begins to happen in certain structures. Like for us as professors, the idea of tenure becomes important. What do you mean? No one's guaranteed a job for life. And I'm like, yeah, but if you think about professors, we get 2 promotions in our entire professional career.
Right.
How many other people are limited to 2 promotions in their entire career? You know, when you calculate out the hours spent doing things, most of us don't even make minimum wage. And so to think about that as the bastion of a kind of elitism and privilege, as opposed to the current condition of professors in higher ed being factory workers or piecemeal workers, there need to be alliances that are not obscured by what has become naturalized or what is assumed. That's where refusal begins, because when the discourse reaches a place where it stops or there's an impasse, there's an opportunity to see something different, to engage in something that's productive.
Yeah, and now we're back to the generative capacity of refusal that you began with, which I think is a powerful insight.
These moments of refusal, I've been focusing on seeing the structures of power and domination, but you just now pointed to, and also see a new possibility, like see the world otherwise than it is.
Which is what I thought a lot about in 2020 when life stopped as we knew it. And I won't necessarily call it a refusal because it was a forced stoppage.
Right.
But it also meant people began to think very differently about how we're navigating the world.
Yeah.
And I thought there is an opportunity maybe to understand how dismembering and unlivable many of our lives have been for a long time and are increasingly becoming. But the impetus was always, let's get back to the way things were.
Right.
And I think there is that tension. How do we collectively refuse things as they were, because they were kind of held together with gum and spit.
Yeah. During the pandemic, I think everyone got a tiny taste of precarity. There are people who, of course, live in precarious conditions every day and understand it deeply, existentially, but there is a whole swath of people who never feel precarious. Right. And everyone had to take a breath. Well, not take a breath, right? That was the thing. Don't take a breath. But everyone had to take a moment to think about their own precarity.
Right. And does that acknowledged vulnerability that comes with various forms of precarity, be they economic conditions where you can't flourish, violence to which one is subject because of their membership in a particular social group. There are various forms of precarity that make people more vulnerable, not by individual choices, but through structures. Does our acknowledgement of collective vulnerability form a bridge to possible coalition?
Right.
And to me, that's a big question because, as James Baldwin would say, we have to begin to count the dead bodies in order to really reckon with the ways in which our continued participation in certain structures, if it's not killing us, it's certainly meaning that we're building our kingdoms on many corpses. That's where refusal becomes important.
Yeah, just a few weeks ago, we had Zahi Zalua on the podcast to talk about the Palestinian question and situation in Gaza. And he used this phrase, the Gazification of the world. And I think what you're describing is exactly what he meant by that. This move to make people more and more and more precarious, and precarious not in the normal way that we think about it as disempowered or in need or suffering, but precarious in perhaps the way that we've been moving to in this conversation, unable to even refuse the situations of their own precarity.
Yeah. And I think about the slippage of that in terms of surveillance, in terms of our digital presences, in terms of, in the US, our inability to engage what in the European Union is the right to be forgotten.
Yeah.
We are digital commodities in ways that, in order to function in everyday activities, there's no longer the capacity to refuse. Can I not be forced into arbitration on my credit card and still have a credit card? Probably not.
Right.
Can you not accept the terms and conditions?
Yes. And still use the product, right?
No.
It becomes important because if I'm not exercising my muscle to refuse, then I'm often exercising the muscle to
Obey.
or to find something to be ambiguous so that maybe I am discomforted by it, but I can pass off that discomfort not as a complicity with something that's immoral, but as an ambiguity or a confusion.
Or worse, a necessity.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, Devonya, I want to thank you again for joining us on the podcast today. This has been just an absolutely fascinating and really generative conversation, and it's given me a lot to think about going forward. But our bartender is giving us last call. She is literally refusing to serve us anymore. And so we are going to have to wrap it up and get out of here. Before we do that, I want to give both of you a chance for final thoughts. So let me go to you first, Devonya.
Well, thanks. It has been a great conversation. And I think my closing thought is around the generative nature of refusal as sometimes world building, that often in the refusal to accept the terms that we're given, it gives us the opportunity to create worlds and to imagine the worlds that we want to live in. For me, I think of those worlds as places where not only can my kids live, but it's a place where they can flourish as who they are.
Yeah. I want to join Lee, Devonya, in thanking you. This has been a really great conversation and opened up a lot of insights for me, especially around what you were just talking about, the generative nature of refusal, that it's not just negation, it's an opening and productive. And in the back of my mind, I had been thinking during the conversation about Bell Hook's Home Place essay, where the subtitle is a place of resistance, but I wonder if it's not also a place of refusal. And some of the same structures that Bell Hooks brings forth in that essay have been resonating with me. So I really just do want to thank you. It's been a really, for me, exciting conversation.
I think one of the things that this conversation has motivated me to think more about is the situations in which my yeses are also refusals, that sometimes refusals are not just say no, but also the way in which sometimes yeses are complicity in other people's generative refusals, and the generative world that are coming out of those refusals is a world that I shouldn't be saying yes to, even though I might be saying yes to this one particular thing. I think that falls into Devonya's larger point about thinking more carefully and critically about our complicity, both in our yeses and in our nos. So this has really given me a lot to think about. But again, our bartender's here. She's refused us. We've got to get out of here. She has actually performed the act of refusal, which is to turn off the lights and start stacking the chairs on the bar. So, Devonya, thanks so much.
Well, thank you for the invite.
We would love to have you back again, and I will catch you guys next time.
Good night.